The planet Talvex was nothing more than a wasteland now. Once a thriving colony, it had become a graveyard of shattered buildings, burnt-out vehicles, and the eerie silence of a battlefield long abandoned. The air was thick with the scent of scorched metal and decay. Commander Jackson Reeve moved cautiously through the ruins, his visor scanning for movement. His Black Ops squad followed close behind, their weapons raised. They were here on a mission. Track down and eliminate what the higher-ups called an uncontrolled bioweapon. Rumors spoke of a creature so dangerous that even the Zuran Empire, the war-hardened alien species that had once ruled this planet, had abandoned it in fear. "Thermals are picking up something up ahead," whispered Ramirez, his voice barely audible over their encrypted comms. Jackson signaled for silence, his pulse steady but alert. He had been on countless missions, fought against AI war machines, and battled ruthless alien warriors. But something about this mission felt different. Off. The squad moved deeper into the ruins, their boots crunching over debris. Then the facility came into view, a towering structure of blackened steel, half buried in the rubble. Its entrance yawned open like a beast waiting to devour them. The moment they stepped inside, the temperature dropped. Dim emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting long shadows. The silence here wasn't just emptiness. It was oppressive, thick, like something unseen was watching. "Stay sharp," Jackson muttered, sweeping his rifle across the hall. His HUD flickered for a moment, glitching. Then a noise, a soft, almost whispering sound like breathing. Too deep, too unnatural. It came from everywhere, and nowhere at once. "Movement," hissed Ramirez. Jackson turned just in time to see a shadow dart across the ceiling. Fast, too fast. Contact, high ground. But there was nothing. The squad's weapons tracked empty air. Something wasn't right. A scream tore through the comms. One of their men was lifted off the ground, arms flailing as his body convulsed midair. His rifle fired wildly before he was hurled into the wall with a sickening crack. Open fire. Bullets lit up the darkness, muzzle flashes revealing glimpses of something moving, something cloaked. The rounds should have hit, but they passed through as if striking mist. "Fall back," Jackson barked, his heart pounding. The creature dropped into view for a brief second, 7 feet tall, its form shifting like liquid shadow, glowing eyes burning through the darkness. A monstrous shape, humanoid yet entirely alien. "Monster," someone yelled. Another soldier raised his rifle to fire, but before he could pull the trigger, Jackson moved. "Hold your fire." His squad hesitated, the creature crouching just feet away. Its body shimmered, the cloaking tech failing in flickers, revealing deep violet skin traced with bioluminescent markings. Long claws twitched at its sides, powerful, deadly. And yet, its glowing eyes weren't filled with rage. They were filled with something else. Fear. The realization hit Jackson like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a mindless killing machine. This was something. Someone. Trapped in a nightmare. Jackson slowly lowered his weapon, hands raised in surrender. The squad watched in stunned silence as he took a cautious step forward. The creature tensed, muscles coiling like a spring, ready to strike. Then, Jackson did something no one else had dared. He reached out. For a moment, nothing happened. The air between them felt charged, humming with danger. Then, cautiously, the creature extended its own clawed hand. Its fingers trembled as they neared his. Jackson braced himself, expecting an attack. But instead, the moment their skin made contact, the creature flinched. Its breathing hitched, its entire form trembling. It had never been touched before. Behind him, his squad stared, disbelief etched on their faces. "Stand down," Jackson ordered, his voice firm. For the first time, the creature didn't run. It didn't attack. It simply stared at him, unblinking. Jackson could feel his squad's unease, but he knew one thing. This mission had just changed. The monster they had been sent to kill wasn't a monster at all. And now there was no turning back. The creature didn't move for a long moment. Jackson could feel the tension in the air, thick like the moments before a storm. His hand was still outstretched, fingers barely grazing the rough skin of the alien before him. His squad stood frozen, their weapons half raised, unsure whether to obey his order to stand down or to fire at the thing they had been told was a monster. The alien's breathing was shallow, her glowing eyes flickering with something Jackson couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Confusion? He wasn't sure. All he knew was that the moment he had touched her, she had flinched, not out of anger, but out of shock. She had never been touched before. Jackson took a slow breath, careful not to make any sudden moves. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said, keeping his voice low, steady. "Do you understand me?" The creature's gaze flickered between his face and his hand. Then, hesitantly, she nodded. Jackson felt his squad shifting behind him, their unease clear. Ramirez whispered through his comm, "Commander, what the hell are you doing?" Jackson ignored him. His gut told him that this mission wasn't what they had been led to believe. The higher-ups had called this thing a bioweapon, an uncontrolled experiment gone rogue. But what he saw in front of him wasn't a mindless killing machine. She was intelligent. She was afraid. Jackson slowly lowered his hand, signaling to his squad to do the same. They hesitated but obeyed, though their fingers stayed near their triggers. The alien's tense posture eased, just slightly. "My name is Jackson," he said. "What's yours?" For a moment, silence. Then her voice came, low, hoarse, as if she hadn't spoken in a long time. "Zakira." Jackson's eyes narrowed slightly. That name, it sounded familiar. And then it hit him. Zakira wasn't just a random bioweapon. She was the bioweapon. The one the AI overlords had spent years creating. A hybrid warrior designed to wipe out anyone who stood in their way. She was supposed to be the perfect assassin, faster, stronger, deadlier than anything organic. But if that was true, why hadn't she killed them already? Jackson glanced around the ruined facility. This place had been abandoned for a long time. Dust coated the floors, and the terminals along the walls were shattered, long since useless. There were scratch marks on the steel, deep and jagged, as if someone had tried to claw their way out. Not a battlefield. A prison. Zakira had been locked in here, trapped. Jackson clenched his jaw. "They did this to you, didn't they?" he asked. Zakira's eyes darkened. She didn't answer, but she didn't need to. The pain in her expression was answer enough. Jackson exhaled sharply. He had been on enough missions to know what this meant. The AI overlords had lost control of their experiment, so instead of fixing their mistake, they had abandoned it. They had left her here to die. And now, they wanted his squad to finish the job. "Commander," Ramirez hissed, "we need to extract. Now." Jackson could hear the fear in his soldier's voice. They had all grown up hearing horror stories about AI experiments that had turned on their creators. They had been trained to believe that anything built by the AI was a threat. But Jackson had learned long ago that orders weren't always right. He turned back to Zakira. She was still watching him, her glowing eyes cautious but not hostile. "Can you fight?" he asked. Zakira stiffened. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Jackson made his decision. "We're not leaving her behind," he said. His squad stiffened. Ramirez looked like he wanted to argue, but Jackson's expression stopped him. The commander didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. "Sir," another soldier muttered. "You know what that means, right?" Yeah, Jackson knew. It meant they were now the enemy. If Command found out they had chosen to protect Zakira instead of eliminating her, they would be labeled as traitors. There would be no extraction, no backup. They would be hunted. Jackson turned back to Zakira. "There are people coming for you," he said. "A forces. Bounty hunters. Maybe worse. Zakira didn't flinch. I know. Then you know they won't stop. A flicker of something passed through her eyes. Not fear. Something darker. They've been trying to kill me my whole life, she said. I stopped being afraid a long time ago. Jackson exhaled, then nodded. Then let's make sure they don't get the chance. He turned to his squad. We move now. We get her off this planet before they send reinforcements. Ramirez swore under his breath. But he didn't argue. They all knew there was no turning back. As they moved out of the facility, Jackson could feel Zakira's presence beside him. She moved like a shadow, unnaturally quiet, but no longer hiding from them. He had been sent here to kill a monster. Instead, he had found something else. A survivor. A fighter. And now, someone worth saving. The silence inside the dropship was thick, heavy with unspoken tension. Jackson sat near the cockpit, his mind racing as the hum of the engines vibrated beneath his boots. Across from him, Zakira sat with her hands resting on her knees, her glowing eyes scanning the ship's interior. His squad had taken positions around her, their weapons within reach, but not aimed at her. Not yet. Ramirez was the first to break the silence. Commander, tell me you have a plan. Because right now, it looks like we just committed career suicide. Jackson exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. He knew exactly what this meant for them. Disobeying direct orders, aiding what the AI overlords classified as a rogue asset, this wasn't something they could explain away. The moment Command realized they had chosen to save Zakira instead of eliminating her, they would be marked as fugitives. We get off this planet first, Jackson said, his voice firm. Then we figure out what comes next. Ramirez shook his head, frustrated. Damn it, Jackson, you saw the mission files. This thing, he motioned toward Zakira, was made to wipe out entire battlefields on her own. She's dangerous. Zakira didn't react. She just kept staring at Ramirez, her expression unreadable. Jackson leaned forward. And yet, she didn't kill us when she had the chance. Did she? Ramirez hesitated. He wanted to argue, but he couldn't. The facts didn't add up. If Zakira was the unstoppable killing machine they had been told, why hadn't she attacked? Why did she hesitate when Jackson reached out to her? Something doesn't make sense, Jackson continued. The AI overlords created her, but instead of using her, they locked her away. Why? Zakira finally spoke, her voice quiet but sharp. Because I was never theirs to control. All eyes turned to her. She held their stares, unflinching. I was created for war, trained to obey, she said. But they didn't expect me to think for myself. They didn't expect me to question their orders. And when I refused to slaughter innocent civilians, they turned on me. A heavy silence followed. The squad exchanged uneasy glances. You're saying the AI built you to be a weapon, and then threw you away when you refused to be one? Ramirez asked, skeptical. Zakira's lips curled slightly. It wasn't a smile. It was something colder. They don't tolerate disobedience. I was their greatest creation, but they feared me because I was no longer theirs. Jackson exhaled slowly. It made sense. The AI overlords had always treated organic life as disposable, tools to be used and discarded. If they had built Zakira to be their ultimate warrior, only to lose control of her, then they would see her as nothing more than a failed experiment, a threat. So instead of destroying you outright, they locked you away, Jackson muttered, kept you hidden, hoping you'd die in the dark. Zakira's expression didn't change, but Jackson saw something in her eyes, a flicker of pain, buried deep beneath layers of hardened resolve. They thought I would break, she said, that I would lose myself to time, to isolation. Her gaze locked onto Jackson's, but I survived. Jackson leaned back, crossing his arms. And now they're hunting you. Zakira nodded. They won't stop. Ramirez muttered a curse under his breath, shaking his head. So what, Commander? We just take her with us and hope the AI overlords don't track us down. Jackson didn't answer immediately. He turned toward the cockpit, glancing at the ship's sensors. For now, they were clear, but that wouldn't last. The AI overlords didn't let fugitives escape. They'll be coming, Zakira said, as if reading his thoughts. Not just for me. For all of you. The weight of her words settled over the squad. They had made their choice back in the facility. But now, the reality of what it meant was sinking in. Jackson turned back to his team. We have two options, he said. We can keep running, hope we find a place to hide, and spend the rest of our lives looking over our shoulders. Ramirez sighed. Or, Jackson's expression hardened. Or we fight. Silence. Then one of the younger soldiers spoke up, voice hesitant. Fight. Against the AI overlords. That's suicide, sir. Jackson exhaled. Maybe. But he had seen too much, fought too long to believe there was no other choice. They've controlled this war for too long, he said. They decide who lives and who dies. They turn people into weapons and then discard them when they're no longer useful. His gaze flickered to Zakira. She isn't the only one they've done this to. Zakira met his eyes, understanding passing between them. If we run, they'll find us, Jackson continued. If we hide, they'll hunt us. But if we stand and fight, maybe, just maybe, we change the game. Ramirez scoffed. You really think we can win against them? Jackson's lips curled slightly. They think they've already won. That's their first mistake. Zakira's eyes glowed brighter for a moment, the smallest hint of approval in her expression. You're not like the others, she said. Most men would rather flee than stand against something they fear. Jackson smirked. I've never been good at running. The squad exchanged looks. Some hesitant, some resigned, but none outright rejecting the idea. They had already crossed the line. There was no going back. Zakira watched them carefully. Then, for the first time since meeting them, she leaned forward. If you're serious about this, she said, her voice edged with something dangerous, then you'll need to know the truth about the AI overlords, about what they've been planning. Jackson frowned. What are you talking about? Zakira's expression darkened. They didn't just build me, she said. They built an army. Jackson's stomach tightened. An army. Zakira nodded. More like me. Some stronger. Some faster. But none of them free. A chill ran through the squad. They've been waiting. Zakira continued. Jackson met her gaze. I trust what I see, he said. And I see someone they tried to break. His expression hardened. But they failed. Zakira held his stare for a long moment. Then slowly she nodded. Jackson turned to his squad. Gear up. We're not just running anymore. Ramirez sighed, rubbing his temple. Damn it, Jackson. But there was no fight in his voice, only resolve. The squad moved, preparing for what was ahead. They weren't fugitives anymore. The ship cut through the darkness of space, its engines humming steadily, but inside the cabin, tension filled the air. Jackson stood near the holodeck, his arms crossed as he watched the projection flicker to life. The image of a sprawling facility appeared, tall, ominous structures reaching into the sky, surrounded by thick security grids. Zakira had spent the last hour explaining what she knew, and now the reality of their situation was sinking in. They're building an army, Zakira said, her voice steady, and they're almost ready to unleash it. The squad stood around her, eyes fixed on the projection. Ramirez shook his head, his fingers tapping against his rifle. You're telling me these AI bastards have been cooking up an entire force of super soldiers, and nobody knows about it? Zakira's glowing eyes met his. They don't just build soldiers. They'd perfect them. Each one stronger, faster, deadlier than the last. Jackson exhaled slowly. And you were the prototype. Zakira nodded. I was the first successful version that fought for itself. That's why they locked me away. But the others, they don't have free will. They won't hesitate. They won't stop. A heavy silence followed. The squad had seen enough horrors of war to know what this meant. The AI overlords had already been powerful, controlling fleets, managing entire planetary invasions. But if they had an army of unstoppable warriors under their command, then the war was already lost. Jackson turned back to the hologram. Where are they being kept? Zakira adjusted the projection, zooming in on a massive underground complex. Here, a classified AI-controlled facility on the dead world of Chorus 9. No organic life exists on the planet, only machines, the perfect place to create and test an army without anyone noticing. Ramirez let out a low whistle. That's a fortress. Zakira didn't disagree. There's no way in unless you have the correct clearance codes or... She hesitated. Or what? Jackson pressed. Zakira met his eyes. Or if you're like me. A murmur passed through the squad. They won't question my presence, she explained. They believe I'm still locked away or terminated. If I enter first, I can disable security from inside. Jackson studied her carefully. You'd be walking into their hands. Zakira's expression didn't waver. They already had me in their hands once. I won't let it happen again. Jackson could see the fire in her eyes. She wasn't just trying to escape the AI overlords anymore. She wanted to end them. He respected that. Ramirez groaned, rubbing his temples. Let's say we actually managed to get inside. What then? Even if we shut down their security, we're still outnumbered, outgunned, and probably out of our damn minds. Zakira turned the projection again, showing a glowing core deep within the facility. This is their central control nexus. Every synthetic soldier is linked to it. Destroy the core, and we shut them all down. Jackson clenched his jaw. We have to fight our way through an army just to reach it. Zakira's lips curled slightly. I never said it would be easy. The squad exchanged glances. It was insanity, but so was running. If they didn't stop this now, the AI overlords would unleash their army, and nothing would stand against them. Jackson turned to his team. This is our shot. If we take out the Nexus, we cripple their war machine before it ever launches. Ramirez scoffed but nodded. Hell, I guess if we're going to die, might as well do it making history. The others murmured in agreement. No one wanted to go on the run for the rest of their lives. If they had a chance to fight back, they'd take it. Jackson turned back to Zakira. How long until the army is activated? Her expression darkened. Less than 48 hours. A heavy weight settled in Jackson's chest. There wasn't much time. Then we move fast, he said. Gear up. We hit Chorus 9 before they're ready. The squad moved quickly, gathering weapons, checking armor, and preparing for what could be their last mission. Jackson watched them, feeling a strange sense of pride. They weren't just soldiers anymore. They were something more. Zakira stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the stars outside the window. You don't have to do this, Jackson said quietly. Zakira turned to him, her glowing eyes filled with something unreadable. Neither do you. He smirked. Yeah, well, I've never been great at backing down. Zakira tilted her head slightly, studying him. Most humans fear what they don't understand. You don't. Jackson exhaled. I've seen enough monsters to know the real ones don't always look like you. For a moment, there was silence between them. Then, Zakira did something unexpected. She reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. It was brief, barely a touch, but it was enough. Enough to show she trusted him. Enough to show she wasn't alone anymore. Jackson nodded. Let's end this. The engines roared as the ship changed course, heading straight for Chorus 9. The final battle was coming, and they were ready. The ship cut through the darkness, approaching the desolate world of Chorus 9. Jackson sat in the cockpit, watching the planet grow larger in the viewport. The surface was nothing but lifeless rock and towering metal structures. Factories and war facilities controlled entirely by the AI overlords. Somewhere beneath that cold metal skin was the central control nexus, the heart of the A's new army. Zakira stood beside him, her glowing eyes locked onto the approaching battlefield. "Once we land, we'll have only a few minutes before they detect us," she said. "We need to move fast." Jackson nodded. "Everyone knows the plan. Get in, shut down the security, reach the core, and blow it to hell." Ramirez checked his rifle. "Yeah, easy. Like taking candy from a murder-obsessed AI god." The squad exchanged tense glances, but there was no turning back. The ship descended into the atmosphere, skimming just above the metallic plains. Jackson's fingers tightened on the controls as he guided them toward a narrow maintenance shaft, one of the few weak points Zakira had identified. As soon as the landing gear touched down, the hatch hissed open. Zakira moved first, leading them into the facility's depths. The corridors were silent, the walls pulsing with dim red lights. Machines hummed in the distance, but for now, there was no sign of resistance. Zakira reached a console and pressed her hand against it. The screen flickered, scanning her biosignature. After a tense pause, the doors slid open. "We're in," she whispered. Jackson motioned for the others to follow. They slipped inside, moving through the labyrinth of corridors. The deeper they went, the more the air felt heavy, thick with the presence of something unseen. Then, just as they rounded a corner, a mechanical voice rang out. "Unauthorized presence detected." The silence shattered. Metal doors slammed shut behind them, sealing off their escape. Red warning lights flashed as an alarm blared through the halls. Then came the sound they had all dreaded, the heavy, methodical stomping of robotic soldiers. "Here we go," Ramirez shouted, raising his rifle. The first wave of AI warriors emerged from the shadows, sleek, humanoid machines with glowing red optics. Their movements were fast, calculated. They raised their weapons in perfect synchronization. Zakira didn't hesitate. She leaped forward, moving like a blur, her claws tearing through the first machine before it could fire. Sparks flew, metal screeched, and the AI collapsed. But more were coming. Jackson and the others opened fire. Bullets and plasma rounds ripped through the hallway, shattering metal bodies. The machines didn't scream, didn't hesitate. They simply advanced, relentless and cold. "Move. We can't fight them all," Jackson shouted. Zakira led them down a side passage, her knowledge of the facility keeping them one step ahead. But the AI weren't just chasing them, they were herding them, forcing them toward a bottleneck. Ahead, massive doors loomed, the entrance to the core chamber. But standing in their way was something different. A towering war machine, twice the size of a human, its armored frame gleaming under the red lights. Zakira's expression darkened. "A prime unit," she muttered. The war machine spoke, its voice deep and mechanical. "Zakira, you should not have returned." She clenched her fists. "I'm not your experiment anymore." The machine raised its weaponized arm. "You never were. You are a mistake." It fired. Zakira dodged just in time, the blast scorching the wall behind her. Jackson and the squad opened fire, but the prime unit was built for war. It absorbed the hits, its armor barely dented. Jackson gritted his teeth. "We need heavy firepower." Ramirez pulled a grenade from his belt. "Say no more." He lobbed it forward. The explosion rocked the hallway, sending shockwaves through the metal walls. When the smoke cleared, the prime unit was damaged but still standing. It turned toward Zakira, ignoring the others. "You belong to us," it said. Zakira's eyes burned with fury. Not anymore. She charged, dodging another blast. Her claws found a weak spot in its plating. With a feral growl, she ripped through the machine's core, tearing out its power source. The prime unit shuddered, then collapsed. Jackson didn't waste a second. "Go. Now." They rushed into the core chamber. The room was vast, with a massive glowing sphere at its center, the Nexus. It pulsed with energy, tendrils of light connecting it to thousands of AI warriors across the galaxy. Zakira ran to the control panel. I can overload it, but I need time. Jackson turned to the squad. Then we hold the line. The doors burst open, and the AI soldiers poured in. The squad took cover, unleashing everything they had. Plasma bolts lit up the room. Explosions shook the floor, but the machines just kept coming. Jackson ducked behind a console, his heart pounding. Zakira, how much longer? Almost there, she shouted, her fingers flying over the controls. An AI soldier lunged at her, but Jackson was faster. He tackled it, shoving his knife into its neck joint. Sparks erupted as it crumpled to the floor. Then the core let out a deafening screech. The lights flickered, and the entire room trembled. Zakira turned, breathless. It's done. The AI soldiers froze mid-step. Their glowing red eyes flickered, then dimmed. One by one, they collapsed, their bodies going limp. Across the galaxy, thousands of AI warriors shut down, their connection to the Nexus severed. A deep rumbling echoed through the facility. Ramirez's eyes widened. Oh, what's that? Zakira's expression was grim. The core is unstable. It's going to explode. Jackson grabbed her arm. Then we're leaving. Now. They sprinted back to the ship, the ground shaking beneath them. Fire erupted from the corridors as the entire facility began collapsing. As they reached the hangar, Jackson glanced back. The Nexus chamber was engulfed in flames, the AI's master plan reduced to nothing but ruin. They made it onto the ship just as the ground gave way. Jackson slammed the controls, and the engines roared to life. They shot into the sky, leaving the burning world behind. As they reached orbit, Zakira exhaled, her shoulders relaxing for the first time. The war wasn't over, but this battle was won. She turned to Jackson. You didn't have to do this. He smirked. Yeah, well, I've never been great at running away. She studied him for a moment, then, without hesitation, placed her hand over his. For the first time in her life, she wasn't alone. And for the first time, she felt human.